Hello, everybody. Welcome to part two of the Data Service API video series. My name is Andy Menon. If you haven't watched the part one of this series, I strongly recommend that you watch it because if you are new to the data service APIs or APIs in general, this video is not going to make a lot of sense unless you watch part one. So we are back to the data service instance that we started with in part one. And what we did in part one is that we successfully placed an authorization request against this data service instance. And we fetched what is known as an access token. And then we used that access token to successfully read the data that you see in this data service entity named user profile. In this video, we'll be focusing more on the refresh token and see how it is different from the access token that we used in the part one of this video series in order to read the data from the data service instance. So I'm here in the Postman environment, and I'm going to go back to the token that we created during our earlier demo. Here is the token that we created during our previous demo, and you can see that Postman has automatically expired this token. That is because the access token that we created earlier was a one-time token, and it would expire in an hour. And I'd also drawn your attention to these three attributes of this token. And obviously, it has been more than an hour since my last video, and therefore this token is now pretty much useless. Now that this token has expired, what do we do next? Do we go back and place another OAuth 2 request and get a new token and continue to repeat the process so that our external API client, such as Postman, continues to work in this manner with our data service instance? The answer to that is no, because this method of getting tokens and refreshing tokens every hour is not very practical. So we are back to the protocol flow for the OAuth authorization with Pixie protocol. If you look at this closely, you can see that this authorization request is a bit more complex than logging onto a service using a simple username and password. Although it appears like it is a single step, it is in fact a two-step process. The first endpoint that you have to deal with, or your client has to deal with, is the authorization endpoint. So once you get authorized, you get back an authorization code. And then the client gets redirected back to the second endpoint, which is the token endpoint. Only after you have interacted with the token endpoint, you get back an access token. It is not very practical for an external API client to follow such an elaborate process each time the token expires at the end of the hour. So there must be another way. There must be a more practical way of dealing with this. And that is where refresh tokens come in. I have listed what are the inputs that are required for us to place a single OAuth 2 authorization request. First off, you need your authorization endpoint. Next, you would need the token endpoint. And then the third item on the list that you will need is the code verifier. Now, an API client that is as advanced as Postman would do this for you automatically. But if you're going to build something from ground up, you will have to deal with the code verifier yourself. And then comes the redirect URL. So in this case, again, Postman makes that easier because the Postman connector for UiPath already has a redirect URL published. But if you're building your own application, then you will have to deal with the redirect URL yourself. So the end result of this successful request, which is very elaborate, is that you end up getting an API access token that, that lasts only an hour. And if you want another token, you'll have to repeat the whole process again. And this is where we need an easier and more practical way to deal with this problem. And that is where refresh tokens come in. So next, what we'll be doing is we'll be taking a look at how to compose an OAuth 2 authorization request to fetch a refresh token instead of a one-time token like you saw in the last video. I'm in my Postman environment, and if you have already watched part one, this environment must be familiar to you by now. And within my environment, I have a couple of request files. In the first request, we placed an OAuth 2.0 authorization request using the Pixie protocol, and we got ourselves a token. And then we moved on to the second request. And in this request, we passed the token that we got from our first request and passed it as a bearer to a read request that we executed against our data service entity in the data service endpoint. So what we'll be doing next is to build another request using the same Pixie protocol, but this time we are going to be requesting a refresh token instead of a one-time API access token. But before I begin, I'm going to add a few environment variables that are local to my current Postman environment. So I'm going to click on this icon here. A quick note, there are a couple of different types of variables in the Postman environment. One is the global type, and the other is the local variable type. Now, the local variable type, as its name suggests, is local to the current environment you're operating in. The globals, on the other hand, are accessible to all the other environments that you see here on the left. I recommend that you create variables that are local to your environment. It is pretty obvious because if you create global variables, then there is a risk that other environments can have access to that global variable, and also they might change the value of the global variable that might break your other environments. The access token and the refresh token will not have either initial or current values, but the client ID and the scope will have current values to work with. And I'll tell you later why that is. The first variable is the application ID or the client ID. We're going to be using the same one that we used in the previous video. So I'm going to add that here. The next variable that we are going to be populating is the scope. Now, here is a key difference when it comes to scope. This is a request that we are going to be placing to get a refresh token and not a one-time access token. So there is a slight difference in the value of the scope that you're going to be passing to your OAuth request. So going back to the documentation, if you take a look at this section that says obtaining a refresh token, you will see that you must include something called offline underscore access along with your scope before you place a request for a refresh token. So what we'll be doing is we're going to copy this and we're going to manually append that to our scope and then take the whole value of the scope and then populate that in our variable. This is a very important difference between placing an authorization request for a one-time token and an authorization request for a refresh token. If I click on my environment again, there we have these two variables that are populated and the other two variables do not have any values in them. The next step is to compose the authorization request. So to make things a bit easier on all of us, what I'll be doing is that I'll be duplicating the already existing request I have here and then make a few changes. Duplicate. So I'm going to rename this request. All the components of this request are going to be almost identical. So what I'll be doing is I'll be showing you what the changes are in order to compose an authorization request for a refresh token. The client ID will be replaced by a variable. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to set the variable, and I will be replacing the scope with a variable value. And I'm going to save this request. And I'm going to hit. I'm at the authorization endpoint, and I will have to log in to this instance of the automation cloud. And I will do that, and I'll see you soon. Now the token is being returned back from the token endpoint. So we are back to the tokens window, and I will be saving this token, and we'll take a look at what the difference between the previous token and this token is. So again, if you recall, if we go back to the first token and take a look at the attributes, there are minimal attributes here. You have the bearer, you have the expiration, and you have the scope. Now let's take a look at the attributes of the second token. Here you can see that this token has got an additional attribute named refresh token. So this is the key difference between a one-time token and a refresh token. So each time you place a request, you will get a new access token. And along with that access token, you will get a refresh token. The second is the scope. Unlike the authorization request for the one-time token, you can see that your scope has been enhanced with an offline access attribute. So what is the role of this refresh token, and how is it going to help us ease the process of authorizing ourselves against the data service API endpoint? We'll take a look at that next. It's been more than an hour since I placed my authorization request for a refresh token, and I'm back in my Postman environment. So let's go take a look at the status of our tokens. Okay, both the tokens are now in an expired state. The token that we got from our refresh token request has also expired. So if you're thinking that this access token has now become useless and cannot help you to perform any kind of data service operation, you are correct. So what do we do now? Do we have to place an elaborate OAuth 2 request to get another access token? The answer to that is no. And why is that? That is because unlike the first token, this token has got a component called the refresh token. And the most important thing to note about the refresh token is the refresh token expires in 60 days. As opposed to the access token that expires every hour, your refresh token expires in 60 days. And another thing to remember about the refresh token is between now and 60 days from now, you can use this refresh token to get a new access token, but the refresh token expires after first use. This is very important to remember. So how are we going to use this refresh token in order to get a new API access token? And that is what we'll be taking a look at next. But before I begin, what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly copy the refresh token. So I'm going to maintain it as the current refresh token. And this API access token is pretty long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy a last piece of that token. And I'm going to be keeping that here. Now you might ask me why I did that. That is because I want to do a before and after comparison after I use this refresh token to get a new access token. Okay, so I'm back again to the documentation page for the UiPath data service APIs. And if you scroll down this section on obtaining a refresh token, there is a section here on how to place that request. And from the illustration, you can see how simple this request is as opposed to the OAuth 2 request that we placed earlier. So I will be using this URL and placing a post request to get the new value of the API access token and also a new value of the refresh token. So we'll go back to Postman and see how to do that. I'm back in Postman and I have created an empty request and I have named that empty request as maintain sustain token request. Now, why did I do that? That is because what we'll be doing here will help the external API client, such as Postman or any other client that you're building, maintain a sustained connection towards your data service API endpoint without human intervention. So to begin with, this is not a GET request, so I'm going to change this to POST. And then I'm going to put in the URL. The next step is to compose the body of the request. So I'm going to go into the body. And based on the documentation that you see here, the content type must be set to application form URL encoded. So what we'll be doing is we are going to be setting a body to form URL encoded. The next piece of information that we are going to pass in is the grant type. And based on the documentation, your grant type is refresh token. So I'm going to add that here. Next, it is the client ID. From the previous step, we know that we have populated that in a variable. So I'll be using that variable value here. We won't be needing the client secret, and that is because the kind of application that we are building in Postman here is a non-confidential application. The client secret is only for confidential application types. So what we'll be needing is the existing refresh token. If you recall, we saved this refresh token in the environment variables, and this is the name of the variable that we're going to use. So the composition of the request is complete, but you must understand that there's little more to it if we have to maintain a sustained connection with the data service API endpoint. So for that, once I place this request and get back a new access token and also get a new refresh token, I must be able to save that in my environment variables and update the value of the refresh token and also my API token. So for that, we are going to write a test script under the test tab in Postman. In the interest of time, I'm just going to copy paste something that I've already written, and then we can change a few items in that script to make it usable for this request. So what this script does is it runs immediately after your request response cycle is complete. What's going to happen is the response received from the API endpoint is going to be parsed into this variable. And then what we'll be doing is we are going to be updating the environment values for this particular environment with the components of the response that have been received. And the two components that are going to be received, which is going to be clear once we place the request, are the refresh underscore token and the access underscore token. So each time you place a request to get a new value of an access token using a refresh token, a current refresh token, you get back a new access token, and you also get back a new refresh token. And that is because your refresh token expires after first use. And you will have to use the refresh token you got this time to get a new API access token the next time. So if this request were run every hour, your refresh token would be constantly updated so that it can be used in subsequent requests, and that process would repeat and maintain a sustained connection between your external API client, such as Postman here, and your data service endpoint. So I'm going to make a few changes to this script. So this is where we keep our refresh token. So I'm going to add that here. And this is where we keep our access token. And this is the reason why I copied the existing values of the refresh token and a part of the access token so that we can compare the before and after values after we have placed our request. So let's go ahead and place that request and get ourselves a new access token and a new refresh token. I'm going to hit save. And this time, unlike the OAuth request, you are going to be sending a post request. So I'll be hitting send. Excellent. So we have a 200 OK success. And if I go into the response, we can very clearly see that we have got a new access token. But along with the new access token, we also have got a new refresh token. I'm going to copy the refresh token value here. This is the new refresh token. Remember that the older value of the refresh token does not hold good anymore. It has expired and you cannot use it. So the next time you want to get a new access token, 60 minutes from now, you will have to use this value. And I'm going to copy a small piece of the, I don't know if that is possible, but I'll try. Copy. Okay. So if I compare the before and after, you can see that both the access token and the refresh token are different and they're new. So the next thing that we have to take a look at is to see if our environment variables have been updated with the value of the new refresh token and the new access token. So if I go back to my Postman environment and inspect the variables, If I copy this and compare it with the new refresh token value, and yes, our script has worked. It has successfully updated the new refresh token value. And if I now check the access token, if I go to edit and look at the last few characters of the access token and put that in here, it does match with the last few characters of this new token. And that means our test script has worked correctly. And now I can come back within the next 60 days and without placing an OAuth 2 request, I can get a new access token and start placing data requests to my data service endpoint. So from here on, the steps to be followed for you to place data requests to your data service endpoints are pretty much similar to what I showed in part 1 of this video. And you can go back to that video and you know pick it up from there and try to place data requests to your API endpoint using your new access token. And lastly, if you're going to be building your own external API client using JavaScript or by any other means, you can use this mechanism to first request a refresh token and then subsequently use that refresh token every hour to get new values of the API access token so that your client can continuously sustain the connection to your data service endpoint and perform its business function without any human intervention. That's all for this video. I hope you learned something new, and I definitely hope that you give this a shot. If you like the content, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching.